Good morning, everyone. I'm the Reverend William Levwood. I'm the minister here, the newly settled minister here at Accotink. Thank you. At Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. Happy to be with you. My pronouns are he and him. As we begin our service, I invite you to silence your phones if you're in person, close your other windows if you're at home on your computer. Take a deep breath and center yourself for worship. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. Right now, it's still unceded. It's still stolen land right now, today in the present. So we seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing, so that all together shall one day know full justice. Just want to remind people that this is our first Sunday where masks are optional. So you notice I've got my mask up there when I'm not speaking, and Paulette doesn't have a mask. So it's up to you. It's your choice whether you have a mask or don't have a mask. We are encouraging masking while singing. Again, that's just an encouragement. I never used to be worried during flu season about the fact that y'all were facing me and singing all your germs right towards me, but now I'm a little nervous about that. Which brings me also just to the idea of courtesy. So if you're at our social hour afterwards and you're going to go talk to somebody and you're going to be up close to them and they're wearing a mask, right? They might be letting you know they'd be more comfortable with you wearing a mask just by wearing a mask. Maybe not, but you just might think about that when you're making choices to communicate with each other as we explore this new terrain together. Happy that we're able to take this step. So we are on the monthly theme of courage, our Soul Matters theme of courage this month. This is the Sunday when the third Sunday of the month, or the third Sunday that I'm in the pulpit, but I've been trying to take a theological perspective on whatever the monthly's theme is. So last month that was belonging, and we looked at the written word, and we looked at how that maybe has divorced us from an animate world, and how we can reconnect to our sense of belonging in that animate world. So today we're going to look at the work of white Unitarian Universalist theologian Sharon Welch, who draws her work from the literature of Black women authors. And we're going to look at this question of courage, of risk, and how that's related to hope. And I think you'll see also, once again, like we talked about when we talked about what makes courage possible, that a lot of what makes hope something that we can risk, something that we can have the courage to engage and act towards, with hope, changing social structures, having the hope that that can happen is a collective action. And when we look at it as a collective action and even as a generational action, then we can access that hope more, similar to how we talked about that collective action is a lot of what makes courage possible. So let's now light our chalice.
And this particular chalice lighting is from a letter that was written by June Jordan to Alice Walker in 1970. And for ourselves, the intrinsic purpose is to reach and to remember and to declare our commitment to all the living without deceit, without fear, and without reservation. We do what we can, and by doing it, we keep ourselves trusting, which is to say vulnerable, and more than that, what can anyone ask? Well, welcome to all of you on this fine October morning. I'm from Chicago. We never had weather like this. We would probably be having snow at this time, so I truly appreciate it. I also noticed that for me, this is the first time that I've seen more of you coming back into the building. And there's something that generates energy for me, probably for Revlev too. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive community that seeks to create a more just and compassionate world. If you're new to Accotink and would like to talk more about this church, you can just about talk to anyone around you, but especially our greeters, our minister, myself. Anyone that has a cross-stitch tag has probably been here a long time and tell you a lot about Accotink. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour online and in person immediately after this service. And I'm going to warn all of those people who are at home right now listening on Zoom. I was just asked to run that Zoom hour, never done it before. So you people who are listening in, you have to give me lots of compassion. And I'm hoping for the best. We're so delightful that you came. Well, the theme for this Sunday basically is hope. And these words are from Rebecca Salton. Hope is a belief that what we do might matter, an understanding that the future is not yet written. It's informed, it's an astute open-mindedness about what can happen and what role we may play in it. Hope looks forward, but it draws its energies from the past, from knowing histories, including our victories, and other complexities and imperfections. It means not being the perfect that is the enemy of the good, and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Not assuming you know what will happen when the future is unwritten, and part of what happens is up to us. To know history is to be able to see beyond the present. To remember the past gives you capacity to look forward as well. It's to see that everything changes, and the most dramatic changes are often the most unforeseen. Hope locates itself in the premise that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room to act. When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcomes, you alone, or you in concert with a few dozen or several million others. Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. Optimists think that it will all be fine without their involvement. Pessimists adopt the opposite position, but both excuse themselves from acting. It is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact are not things we can know beforehand. We may not, in fact, know them afterwards. They do matter all the same, and history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone.
So I'm going to talk today about two different ethics, an ethic of control and an ethic of risk. These come from the white UU theologian Sharon Welch. The ethic of control, she looks at that as the privileged position that tells us, that gives us the message that responsible action is to take action that is successful, right? That we decide to do something to get an outcome, and the outcome happens. That equals responsible action. So you can extrapolate from that to take an action that doesn't lead to a successful outcome, what would that be? That would be irresponsible, right? So this limits us strongly to this ethic of control, of really focusing on what we can control, and the illusion that's often only afforded to people who are in privileged positions, whatever those privileged positions are, whether that's around your race or your gender or your sexuality, that you have the illusion, and sometimes that's really supported through your experience, that you can take an action and it can get the outcome that you want, both in your personal life and in larger societal arenas. It's not something that's afforded when you're in an oppressed or a marginalized position, right? You learn and you can think in your own self of your marginalized identities. We all have both. We all have marginalized and privileged identities. We as Unitarian Universalists, I use this example a lot, are a religious minority. So that's a way that we're marginalized. But you can think about all the ways you might hold marginalized identities and how that has taught you the limits of your power, the limits of your ability to take an action and know that it's going to get the outcome that you want, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Because the problem with an ethic of control is that we only take the action that we know is going to result in the outcome, right? So which actions are most likely to do that? Those are the ones that are already in place, the ones that are already the status quo, the ones that already have a lot of support. And we feel a sense of despair if we can't, if we want to take an action and it's not going to result in a full and completely successful outcome. Because we've been taught that responsible action, according to Sharon Welch, we've been taught that responsible action is an action that results in the outcome. And anything else is a failure, and it, again, is irresponsible, right? So maybe we shouldn't even be acting. I see Judy is shaking her head.
I'm thinking of Mother Teresa and do it anyway.
Well, so this is not true for everybody. I'm just talking about this is an ethic that is at play in many moments in our lives, in many places in our society and in our psyche. So it's not always active. And in fact, Sharon Welch looks to the literature of black women to develop what she calls a feminist ethic of risk. And since she's drawing it from the work of black women and the life experience of black women, I think she should have called it a black feminist ethic of risk. So in that situation, so maybe this is the situation that Mother Teresa comes from, as Judy mentioned. In that situation, you look at your position in society and you know that there are changes that you want to happen, things that you want to happen that aren't going to happen, that you cannot change, or that you cannot change with one action, or you cannot change completely. So an ethic of risk, you develop a different definition of responsible action. So responsible action in an ethic of risk is what you have the power to do in that within the bounds of those limits on your power. So it's in some ways a lot more realistic, because even those of us who are in positions of privilege, there are limits on our power, right? And we find that. But if we're acting, again, if we're acting from the place that we should be able to get to the outcome, that can lead us to despair and to paralysis and to inaction. Whereas if we come from an ethic of risk and we accept that there are limitations on our power to begin with, and then we're looking at what actions can we take to move the needle just one step. Maybe even all we can do is create the conditions, the soil, the possibility of the conditions in the future that the change can happen. Maybe we can't even make a small step. All we can do is create communities of resilience and resistance and joy and love and respect and support that become the foundation, the good soil from which that responsible action and that change can come as situations and contexts change over time. That's another problem with the ethic of control, is that situations and contexts are always changing, right? So we never, and we have no control. I have no control over what any of you do. I might have influence, but I don't have control over what any of you do. So to think that I can do something and then get an outcome is setting myself up for failure, and ultimately potentially for despair as opposed to hope, rather than engaging with the community and building the roots, the good soil. You've heard the term good trouble. So I want to introduce this idea of good soil, that responsible action is making the good soil for future actions, for future changes, or even just for the resilience to be able to take future actions, to be able to survive through the challenges and wait for that time and look for that time and make strategic choices to make whatever change could happen and to pause on the ones that can't happen and to not feel despair because we know we're in a long line of generations and generations who are working to make the world that we dream about. So I want to say one more thing about the ethic of control and how it paralyzes us. If you follow the logic of an ethic of control far enough, Sharon Welch suggests, and she was involved in a lot of nuclear disarmament protests, and that influenced her thinking. She suggests that an ethic of control really leads to destruction or to despair, because the only way to have the certainty that an action is going to be not just successful for the moment, but have lasting, unchanging success, really make it stick, is to blow everything up, right? Is to have something not be alive, because life is dynamic and changing. So this ethic of control is dangerous, especially when you take it. Are you thinking of like national and international policy, right? And where this would lead, this kind of thinking, rather than making the changes that we can make with our limited power, we have the illusion or even the assertion that we have ultimate power. We can think theologically about how the image of an omnipotent God trains us to think that somebody can have omnipotent power. Maybe it's the United States American state, right, as a collective could have that omnipotent power, and yet we know we can't, right? And so that ethic of control is dangerous because it leads to destruction ultimately if you follow the logic fully. The other way it's dangerous is that it leads to despair because, as I've explained, right, responsible action is only when you get a full successful outcome. So you're not going to act if you think that you can't do that. And that leads to a failure of nerve, a failure of courage. And it's particularly important to think about how that plays in to when you're in a position of privilege. Because not only does that position of privilege promote the illusion that you have more control than you have, because sometimes you do have more control than you should, it also makes it easier to give up. This is a quote from Sharon Welch. It is easier to give up on long-term social change when one is comfortable in the present, when it is possible to have challenging work, excellent healthcare and housing, and access to the fine arts. So for those of us who are privileged enough to be in the middle class, what is our motivation to really be courageous and move for social change, right? There's a motivation to not do that, and to rest in the comfort that we have. It's dangerous to take those risks sometimes. So the comfort and the control conspire to accustom us to a quiet despair to inaction or to action that is neither realistic and strategic enough nor bold and visionary enough to actually bring about the social change that we long for. So I want to give an example and a little content warning. I'm going to talk about rape and sexual assault. So I'm going to give an example about the Montgomery bus boycott. So we all know about Rosa Parks in 1955. Does anybody know about Claudette Colvin? So Claudette Colvin was 15 years old and refused to give up her seat on the bus a few months before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The difference is that Rosa Parks was well connected in the community. The difference was that Claudette had already done it and people had mobilized and gotten ready to deliberately form an action around Rosa's resistance. But that's not actually what I want to talk about today. What I want to tell you about is a different person, Gertrude Perkins, who 6 years earlier was walking home with a friend, and they separated to go their different ways towards their homes at night. And then 2 white police officers stopped the car and told Gertrude Perkins that she should get in the car, that she was drunk, and that they were going to take her down to the station. And then they drove to the end of a road, and they raped her. Now that could and often is the end of the story. But what happened in this case is she went to a local minister, Solomon Sayes, and she told him what had happened that very night. And he wrote it down, word for word. He had it notarized. He sent it to a popular newspaper columnist and radio host, Drew Pearce, a liberal white newspaper host. And then Drew shared it on his show and in his columns, and now the nation knows about this event. And what happens next is it mobilizes the black community in Montgomery. And not only does it mobilize them, but it brings them together. There were divisions within that community, a lot of which were around class, different classes within the black community. But now they're all mobilized around the desire to protect black women's bodily integrity and sovereignty and safety. So that's in 1949. Things keep happening. And the story that's often not told is that black women didn't just want the right to not have to stand up and keep their seats on the bus, but they were regularly harassed. They were the victims of violence. They were the victims of sexual assault on those buses. Those buses that as working class people, they had to ride every day to get to their jobs. So every day they're stepping into the line of fire. Every day they're not in that comfort that leads to that privileged despair. They have clear and present motivation for action. And that is the story that's not often told about what creates the good soil, even from bad things, right? From the compost, right? Creates that good soil that is the fuel for the Montgomery bus boycott. So historian, I'm going to have to check my notes. Historian Danielle McGuire talks about this in her 2010 book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance. She tells this story of the Montgomery boycott, and she really emphasizes that it was a women's movement in 2 important ways. Even though you had black male ministers like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. using their privilege in support of their marginalized community, both as black people, but also in particular for black women, it's black women who made that movement happen. They're the ones who showed up and filled the pews at the meetings. They're the ones who walked to work. They're the ones who organized the carpools that took people to work. They're the ones who did the fundraising that sustained the movement. And ultimately, it was a movement to protect their bodily integrity and their dignity in the first place. That's really what it was about. And in this book from Danielle McGuire, she makes it clear that that was not an isolated situation, that there were multiple events and actions in the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s that were motivated by violence and even sexual violence against black women, and then that mobilized the community to take action. So I just want to come back to Sharon Welch's theory of an ethic of risk, because I want to point out that it creates the mobilization that happened after Gertrude Perkins was assaulted, which, by the way, there was a grand jury hearing but no trial, and the city even never released the names of the police officers. They were never public. So it didn't actually change anything, right? It didn't get justice for Gertrude in that moment, but it laid that good soil foundation for further action that 6 years later bore fruit in the bus boycotts of 1955 and 56. Do you see how that works? How the responsible, and Gertrude Perkins didn't know what was going to come of her action. She didn't know if it was going to be successful, right? She wasn't acting from an ethic of control that if I speak out, X is going to happen. She was acting from an ethic of risk, we could presuppose, in some sense of the word. And that's why she took that action that created that good soil for future change. So I want to talk about just a couple more kind of aspects of this good soil. So an important one is the maintenance that Sharon Welch lifts up, is the maintenance of self-respect. She says that one of the most important features of resistance, of the further work for justice, is the creation and maintenance of self-respect in the face of people and institutions who violate an individual's, a people's sense of self-worth. So that's good soil. Anytime that we lift ourselves up and lift up the other people around us, particularly when people are saying that that identity or that position in society is less than, we're creating that good soil, that foundation for further action. We can do that in our families. We can do that here in this church community. We can do that in our schools. Which brings me to another point, which is that the embeddedness in a community of resistance, of alternative structures and ways of being together, is another way that we make that good soil. Because we can get recharged at that meeting, that civil rights meeting, where we go and get recharged and sing songs together and experience beloved community, experience the world that is not yet, that we're making come about. So I mentioned that this ethic of risk is drawn from the work of black women authors. So I want to point out some of those authors. Those are people like Mildred Taylor, Toni Cade Bambara, and Polly Marshall, and also Toni Morrison, who is the author of December's Banned Book Club selection, The Bluest Eye. So I encourage you to read that book and come to that discussion. That banned book, that book is one of the books, just to underscore this point, that UU theologian, white UU theologian Sharon Welch uses as a foundation for our theological foundation as UUs. So that reading that banned book and keeping that banned book able to be read is an act of resistance and a protection of our religious values. And then we've talked a lot about this creation of a matrix for further resistance. The extent to which an action is an appropriate response to the needs of others is constituted as much by the possibilities it creates as the immediate results. So I want to give another example of that. This is from Rebecca Solnit, who gave us the words for our reading. So she talks about the 1970s anti-nuclear movement as well, just like I mentioned that was a big part of Sharon Welch's grounding. And she quotes L.A. Kaufman, who wrote the book Direct Action, Protest and the Reinvention of American Radicalism. And there's a group called the Clamshell Alliance that was inspired by an extraordinary protest that happened in 1975 in West Germany that was able to get the government to abandon plans to build a nuclear reactor. So the Clamshell Alliance tried to do this in New Hampshire. And while they got extensive media coverage against the Seabrook nuclear power plant, they were not successful in stopping the plant. But they did inspire a sister organization, the Abalone Alliance in Central California, which used similar strategies to try to stop the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. But guess what? They didn't succeed either. So Rebecca Solnit tells us we could consider that a failure. But that Kaufman notes that it continued to inspire people around the country who organized their own anti-nuclear groups, and that movement brought about the cancellation of more than 100 planned nuclear projects over the next several years, as well as raising public awareness and changing public opinion about nuclear power. And Rebecca Solnit says, and then she gets into the really exciting part. Kaufman gets into the really exciting part about the Clamshell Alliance's most striking legacy, which is that the way that they went about organizing through direct action and consensus became the large-scale direct action organizing model for the next 40 years, picked up by the Pledge of Resistance, a nationwide network of groups organized against US policies in Central America in the 1980s, used by ACT UP activists for gay rights as well. So those two failed actions made the good soil and the framework for further resistance that had long-reaching, successful campaigns to make social change. So I want to close by saying that hope is rooted in that good soil. It's rooted in responsible actions that don't solve the whole problem in one fell swoop. I won't be in the pulpit, by the way, the Sunday after the election, but you might want to think about these words. Perhaps. On that day, I don't know how it's going to go. And I'm not assuming we all have the same desires for the same outcome, but you may feel jubilant, you may feel really in despair, you may feel all mixed up with some of both. So it might be helpful to remember that hope is rooted in good soil, that responsible action is not making the change in one fell swoop, but comes from strategic, collective, courageous actions that accomplish what can be accomplished, and when even that isn't possible, set the stage, the foundation, the fertile soil for further resistance. And that hope is also rooted in a community of resistance, a community that knows their history, that's committed to action in the present, and that's preparing the next generations for action by nurturing them in communities of love and respect. So may this be a community like this. May we have the courage to engage in strategic risk that makes good soil. May we be that courageous and committed community. Amen, 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 and blessed be.
Though we extinguish our chalice flame, we carry within us what we kindled, the light of inspiration, the warmth of compassion, the fire of commitment. May we bring these gifts into our lives and share them radiantly in the world. I invite you all now to stand. You can hold hands, or you can put your hands out in the air if you want. and say with me these words of the community blessing that was first written by David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one, in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.
I just want to say that I hope that we'll take that chalice flame that's still burning in our hearts, even though it's extinguished here, that's still burning in our hearts, and we'll burn down that white flag of surrender that tells us to sink into despair and to give up the fight. And instead, we'll speak up and we'll show up together as a community for as long as it takes, always making that good soil for the next action. May it be so.